Spirit, calm us and speak to our hearts. You yourself minister to our souls and give us an awareness of the things that we need to know, that we may be your channels of grace for other people and have a word for them in their time. This morning there was this passage from the Apostle when he instructs Titus with regard to the duties of those who minister. And so it does apply to us too. One in particular hit me. It regards the responsibility that we have in what we teach, the ministry of communicating the Word. It concerns us. You yourself set an example of good works. Verbo et exemplo. We speak and preach by our whole being. Hearing this comment years ago in France with regard to one who was giving lectures to those in formation. He gives each point as though it were a completely indispensable point, but if one found one in 1,000 which he practiced, one would be amazed. So, coherence. You yourself an example of good works by sincerity and earnestness when you are teaching, and by a message sound and irreproachable. So, sound teaching, so that any opponent will be at a loss, with no accusation to make against us. And unfortunately, we're sometimes up against it when it comes to what we might have to say, because this is immediately used as a lever when it comes to opposing the Word. And what about scandal? Indeed, one hesitates about going into a situation where there is a name for scandal, for one then becomes associated with the scandal. But of course, all this is a huge false leverage used by the enemy of mankind, who disguises himself as an angel of light. And it's what's out there massively, at least in Ireland, with regard to the media. It's weighted and stacked against the church, using this leverage. The fact is that one can spend one's time making accusations so as to avoid the real issue. As we all know, if we opt to jump out of the vessel of salvation, we are alone in the sea. The ark is what has the means. Whether or not we abuse those means is a separate problem. But the church is not just the sum of its members. And I remember being hit more and more when still a Baptist, anti-evangelical, or rather anti-Catholic as an evangelical, that there are actually problems with just spending one's time accusing the Catholic Church, as we were doing. Because it turned out, the more that one read, the more that one saw that there is weighted against us, Protestants, a massive global argument which becomes dangerously uncomfortable at a certain point. One sees that not only is the whole weight of history going in one direction, but also within that weight of history you've got the fact that Catholics have, things that we didn't have at all. God intervening to underline and underscore Catholic dogma. The most that we could have would be apparent miracles of healing as a result of prayer. But here there was something else. In that larger context, therefore, there is far more to our faith than meets the eye. There is those elements of many, many souls who have actually seen what we cannot see in this world, bits of the invisible. That invisible, of course, extends to what is awaiting us on the other side. And there one finds precisely a very Catholic language. I remember being somewhat amazed to find how in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation there were many testimonies which were very uncomfortable for us Protestants to read. There were things like such and such. One was Brithelm, who died, but then when they were burying him, he suddenly sat up and explained what he had seen. He had seen the other side, and having been shown all, he was given the choice of remaining or of going back again. And he chose immediately to go back again, so that he could have more merit and bring more with him, and spend his second life in utmost penance, thereby helping others to avoid the place that he had seen. And he had seen not only hell and heaven, but also all that was between, and that was the bit that we couldn't accept. Purgatory was as old as the church, and so were the means of helping souls, notably the Holy Sacrifice. And if one reads, as I was reading at the time, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, and looks carefully at the 39 articles, one sees that nearly all of them seem to have an axe to grind. They're all spent aiming at doctrine that they're trying to destroy and demolish, often using harsh language, deliberately harsh. And again, that's not a good way of starting. One is founding a church on the base of aggression. And so, when a lot of the language of the 39 articles insists on denying and denying, one is more curious to know why and what is being denied. And then one looks back and one sees, well, actually, serenely, as John Henry Newman saw, the whole world judges calmly. Judicat orbis terrarum. And so, with Vincent and Lerard-Lerens, what has always been said and believed, quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, is the weight that we have to deal with. So in that context, in this month of November, I'd like to spend a few moments on the other side, because this month does help us to see the communion of saints, the nature of the church, and the whole angelic world in which we're involved. Today actually is the memorial of St. Josaphat, and he was aware of the centrality of the liturgy, and he linked it also with the centrality actually of the monastic life, for there we have an anticipation of the angelic upon earth, a locus of encounter. And that, if one looks around, although it's there, it cannot not be there, is being indirectly demolished by practice, because one is behaving quite often in our liturgical assemblies not to, as it were, concentrate on the invisible, the angelic, the divine, the other, the mysterious, the beyond, but on the visible and tangible, and on the pleasing thereof. And as Pope Benedict pointed out more than once, to go into a mode where, for instance, one applauds is to indicate that one has by then lost completely all awareness of the true liturgy in its thrust. The very notion of liturgy has gone and been replaced by what he refers to as some theatrical performance with a vaguely religious hue. And when it comes to applause, it's exactly what has come to a logical conclusion. We're applauding the wrong person. So they, let's give it to them, have not gone that far. And they have an advantage in the East. It's the fact that their heads, their bishops, come from the monastic world and therefore are formed in serene liturgy. If one is daily involved in many hours of slow, majestic otherness, all fasting, then one doesn't quickly go into the other mode, the DJ, who likes to please the ear and the eye and get a round of applause. We need our brethren in the East. And of course, our liturgy contains it, and the saints will always find it. We don't blame the liturgy, the rite, for what we're responsible for. One can celebrate well if one does what one is told, quietly, showing obedience of the will and therefore true worship to the one that we're adoring. To act in disobedience is not an act of worship. And indeed, the former cardinal, head of the Congregation for Divine Worship, Cardinal de Medina, did actually write an article on this question, that the virtue of religion was not being exercised if one wasn't in a state of grace, and therefore that there was no true worship, no matter how beautiful it was, if the will was not in obedience and the soul was not in grace, because the true worship starts at that level. So with regard to what we're at and who we're with in the worship of God, we do well to remember the words that are still there in the liturgy, which we have received from all Christian ages and indeed from pre-Christian ages. The Trisagion has always been there in East and West and was already heard by Isaiah. And from the moment of the offertory onwards, the whole dynamic and thrust is towards that world, sursum corda. There is no more of the earth. And authors like John Chrysostom have emphasized that if we knew what was going on at that point onwards, right through the Divine Liturgy to the consecration, we would kiss the earth as though every morsel of dust were gold. Some have seen the number of angels adoring. It's a huge invisible world. And therefore that's the atmosphere that we need somehow to be aware of and to convey. There are ways of drawing attention to oneself which are out of place. Even the way that we elevate the Master, we can draw attention to ourselves. God doesn't want us getting in the way. So our friends there are the angels, and of course the saints. We need to be aware of the way that St. Michael in particular protects the Blessed Sacrament. He is around and he is trying to use also us to help him to protect against sacrilege. There was a case recently in Ireland where in County Donegal a good priest was celebrating, and he himself was not aware of this until suddenly something happened. He had given Holy Communion And there was a lady who saw a man who wasn't of the parish and had never been seen before, and he was about, obviously, to take the Blessed Sacrament and do something with it. He had not consumed it, and she actually felt inclined to approach him. And also another lady became aware of something at this point. The first lady saw that the host that he had suddenly went into the air, was suspended in the air for a little while, turned and went through the air to the sanctuary area and dropped down into the, by then, completely empty ciborium, which the good priest had just emptied into the other ciborium in the tabernacle. He himself had seen something drop, and he looked, where did that come from? I emptied this. He thought to himself that he must be going mad. However, later that day, a lady phoned him in the presbytery and communicated what she had seen. And there had been another lady who had seen the host in the air and had muttered or slightly made an expression that was audible. Therefore, there were two objective visions or sights of this, and it had gone objectively into the empty ciborium. The priest was very balanced, and that had actually settled his mind that he hadn't been in illusion, that actually something had dropped and the Blessed Sacrament had been dropped, and he realized what had happened there. St. Michael presumably had not allowed that man to go out with the host. Probably he was going to do something awful with it. Now, this month of November is a time to be aware of this, because we know that in Ireland hosts are being taken away. I know of cases where there's an increase of hosts disappearing, strange people coming up in the time leading up to Halloween. And also there's always a pattern of things going wrong in November. There's an increase, for instance, of suicide and strange things going on. The demon is very much aware. He has not faith, but he has knowledge of what is the presence that we have lost. And he's taking advantage of the fact that we have lost it, because people are not realizing what they're at. And we as priests are on the front line of defense, along with St. Michael and the angels. It's a massive responsibility that we have. And not only that, but the defense that we have to owe to the Blessed Sacrament includes also the way that we, in general, approach the sacred and the place where God is. As we have in this reading from St. Paul, we preach by our whole example, verbo et exemplo, so that if we ourselves easily misbehave and give a bad example in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, talking loudly and so on, that's the indirect teaching that we're given. And it's all right to behave in church as we do elsewhere, and to misunderstand the levels of charity. For the first charity in church is towards the one that we're honouring in church, with the rights of God in the forefront. It's not the same as in the church hall, and therefore there's an order in charity. In the Purgatory manuscript which I translated, there are several references to the angelic world and to the importance of St. Michael. He is there not only in the sacramental world, but also at the hour of death. And apparently one sees him. At the hour of death, people are glad to have had a confidence in some saints, for them to be our protectors from God at that terrible moment. Apparently he is seen, and he accompanies the soul. With regard to what the souls themselves see, there are certain things that they're very much aware of. We see St. Michael as one sees angels. He hasn't a body. He comes to purgatory to fetch all the souls which have been purified. He's the one who leads them to heaven. Yes, it's true, he's among the seraphim. He is the first of the angels in heaven. Our guardian angels come to see us too, but St. Michael is so much more beautiful than they. As for the Blessed Virgin, we see her with her body. She comes to purgatory on her feast days and returns to heaven with many souls. While she is with us, our suffering stops. St. Michael comes with her, but when he's on his own, our sufferings continue as usual. With regard to Protestants who die, apparently the fact that no one prays for their soul means that they have a long purgatory. There is, however, one consolation. It's the fact that a lot of them don't abuse grace as we Catholics do. There are fewer of them, but tendentially, especially those who don't have, for instance, a liturgy similar to our own, but have to pray from the heart each time, there is a sincerity there which keeps them a little bit safe. Our danger is that because it works and the system functions, we can go into automatic pilot, and therefore we can abuse what we're doing. And we can, for instance, be very quick in the way that we do them, whether it's the breviary or the liturgy itself. Like the breviary actually is liturgical hours, they're not just vocal prayers. And this is something that will come back to us on our copybook, because the way we handle the divine one day will come back to us. So, with regard to Protestants, there are several indications in this work that the Lord is trying his best to get at any soul, and therefore we must have the same attitude. The attitude before a soul is this is an immortal gem, and my duty is to do what I can when before this soul to make sure that that soul is not lost, because that soul has been brought to me right now by divine providence. And the good pastor will not let a single one be lost. Thence comes the duty that we have to exercise charity and warmth, whoever is coming to us, because that could be the last time they'll come. And there are stories of people who have been put away by a bad and cold reception. We are at that point on the frontier, and a word from us can save. And in this context, we see that God is working within the context that's out there. And to some extent we must do the same. Whether it's rich people, traveling people, gypsies, whatever they are, each one is unique and is an immortal soul. And we must try to pull out that bit of light that is still there and not put it out forever. And by the way, even though the fullness of truth and grace is to be found only in the Catholic Church, the fact is that the Holy Spirit, because his goodness itself, is very much at work also amongst our separated brethren. Always, of course, ultimately drawing them to the fullness of light, as John Henry Newman eventually saw when he couldn't face any more what he was in. He saw it as a purely human institution. Sicurus judicat orbis terrarum. The whole history of the Church was against what he was saying in his teaching about the branches. So it is that God nevertheless was using him already as a good Anglican minister, and we knew from the testimony that's come through to us that he was a good Anglican minister already before he visited his people. He was a conscientious preacher, influencing many souls in the university. I've heard so many stories from Wales about things that went on within the context of the country, which is hugely Protestant. But there were things that came from the power of preaching. One day we were taken to a famous pulpit where the history of Wales was swayed. It was an interesting candidate who was listening to a sermon there by Priest Davis. He was preaching just before Easter on the importance of getting ready for Easter and receiving the sacraments. Although they weren't valid, nevertheless there were encounters, and God obviously was trying his best to get through to his people there in Protestant Wales back in the 1700s. And he put it this way, this good preacher: "You may tell me that you are not fit to make the communion. I tell you, if that is the case, you are not fit to pray. If you're not fit to pray, you're not fit to live. If you're not fit to live, you're not fit to die." And there was one young man in the congregation, Howell Harris, who felt goose pimples creeping through him, went home, knelt for the first time in sincerity, and poured out his life before God, and became one of the greatest preachers that Wales ever had. All because of a sermon. And we can, if we take it seriously, have an effect. The word, especially coming precisely from a validly ordained priest, in the context of what God wants positively in the liturgy, accompanied by the Blessed Sacrament, can do an awful lot. Why should our President take more seriously what we can't be bothered with? And the very fact of removing physically the pulpits from our churches is not very wise, because the pulpit themselves, actually they give power and authority physically to a preacher. We've lost a lot by adapting to the mode. So, for instance, we have this case. The English woman, therefore, she would have been a Protestant, drowned at Mont Saint-Michel, actually went to heaven. She had the required contrition, so that's the essence, the will at that point. God, with his angels, is doing their best to make sure that the will is got to somehow at that point. Remember, in a prison, in a castle not far from us, it was Beaumaris Castle in Anglesey. There were executions there way into the 1800s. And there was the last execution that took place there was controversial, because they always had the minister or ministers to help. And there was more than one minister actually trying to get this convict to accuse himself, to accept what he'd done. And he kept on saying in Welsh he hadn't done it. And they were dismayed. They thought he was denying it. But the truth obviously was that he hadn't done it. But the point about all this was, in those periods when executions took place, they always had the chaplain there. People were aware that death was death. Each death means eternity somewhere. And all is in the balance at the moment of death. And we can change its direction. So she had the required condition at the moment of death, at the same time the baptism of desire. All this took place through the intervention precisely of St. Michael, who was looking after the area. Blessed shipwreck. The question then of suffering in general is important, because if we have suffering as our lot, or if we're hanging people who have suffering as their lot, we can encourage them. They can do their purgatory here on earth if they suffer well. Pius IX, it says, went straight to heaven. His purgatory was done on earth. But then we come to our own time, because if this is true at that time, when we know what happened in the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s in France, Freemasonry was rising to power and was having very negative effects on the church. This was directly satanic, and it's happening in many parts of the world again right now, in the different forms, but one sees how, strangely enough, there's a collusion between forces against the Catholic Church. Once again, it's not just political. St. Michael will intervene in the Church's personal battle. He is the leader of this Church, now so fiercely persecuted, though not so soon annihilated as these evildoers think. He too is France's special protector, and will help her to take once more its position as elder daughter of the Church. Because in spite of all the offences being committed in France, there is nonetheless a lot of good left. And we find that too in all pockets of the Church. There are faithful souls, and instinctively they will gravitate towards faithful priests. These then are those who are with us. St. Michael, although not named by name, is thought to be the one that is invoked at the moment when we incline profoundly and say Supplices te rogamus omnipotens Deus, then the angel in question is presumed to be Michael, because he is the one who protects the Blessed Sacrament. I was talking one day to a nun who has since gone to her reward. Actually, her signature is on this book which I had for my profession, the Bible, in calligraphy. Sister Monica, she had gifts, but when she was a young nun, she was in church somewhere, and kneeling at the altar rails as they were in those days, the priest whispered, "Sister, follow that man. He's got the Blessed Sacrament." So she got up, went out of the church, and he was on his way out, and she caught up with him, and she knew that he had the Blessed Sacrament. He was denying it. And at the point where she was there, being a woman against a man, there was not much more she could do, short of physical force, which was nonsense, because he was a strong man. And she pleaded with him. And she got to a point where, because he was denying it, she couldn't do any more. So she had this thought, well, I can't do any more. And then she heard this voice inside her. Hold your ground. And suddenly she looked at him, and he was no longer looking at her, but it seemed at something above and beyond her. And he suddenly pulled out the host from his pocket, which by then was actually starting to crumble because he was under pressure, threw it in her hand and ran off. And she came to herself and realized that was the voice of, as she put it, Michael. And he had somehow made himself visible to him. That was a superior force protecting the Blessed Sacrament. Therefore, that's what we're up against. If we don't, as priests, we'll be judged one day very severely, not protecting the sacred, because we're called apart. And the way in which very easily lay people are allowed to handle the sacred is also a victory for the other side, because priests aren't aware that each time that in practice the Church itself is not being obeyed in its desire by handing over the protection of the Blessed Sacrament and its custody just to lay people is a problem. In the interest of soi-disant participation, it's become just nonsense because it doesn't help. The Lord has a positive will with regard to the certain things that are done by certain people. I conclude with regard to what we're at in the Divine Liturgy. There is a way of preaching which is silent. The whole comportment of the priest in church is a sermon in itself. The way that we handle the Lord uplifts or pulls down. Bad liturgy weakens faith. Good liturgy uplifts and strengthens it. Good participation on the part of the lay people would be to encourage them to know how to create a supportive ministry of beauty, not something which helps them to hurry up, as though Holy Communion were the least important part of the week. A good ministry is that of having intelligent people who could help to create an atmosphere which echoes on earth the beauty of the angels that accompany us. For as Sacrosanctum Concilium indicates, the earthly liturgy is a counterpart of the heavenly. At that point, indeed, the frontier is very thin. Woe betide the priest who is an expert disc jockey and gets a round of applause there where the angels themselves hesitate to move. Lord, give us an awareness of what we're at the altar. Give us a true devotion to the real presence. Use us to protect the sacred. Make of us ministers of your true glory. God, that we may behave in church in a way which is worthy of what we handle, and that we give a message to your people which is directly the one that you want, that they too may be given a notion of the sacred and come on tiptoe to the place where angels dwell among men. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.